Greetings, people. Welcome back to Book Review. I'm your host, Nick Cicada. Dressed for the occasion. Here we go. And like that. And there we go. I'm just going to have to stay like this for the duration of the review. God damn, I'm trapped. Because today, we're talking about Gerald's Game by Stephen King. And it's going to be quite a doozy. Whoops. Oh. It's just mailing tape. It would suck to have to do a whole review like that, I suppose.
Looking for someone special? The Love Line is the answer. Looking for new people? The Love Line is the answer. Looking for romance, love? The Love Line is the answer. Connect with interesting, exciting people. Make new friends or talk to someone special. Call 1-900-646-7900. The Love Line is the answer.
So, yes, welcome back to another book review here in the Book Nook. Today, we're talking about yet another Stephen King classic, Gerald's Game, written during Stephen King's golden period. This one's from 1992, during his hot streak when the King of Horror could seemingly do no wrong, before he settled into the lull of really boring crime procedurals in the 2000s, like Mr. Mercedes and whatever. Oddly enough, there is a Mercedes in this one, but Gerald's Game is much more exciting than any of those. Gerald's Game is a real thriller. It's unique among King's work because it's often mentioned in the same breath as Carrie or It or The Stand or whatever, but there is no supernatural element to Gerald's Game. So on Wikipedia, it's just classified as a thriller. Given how grotesque it is, I would feel inclined to call this horror, basically. So if you've read It, the Tommyknockers, Carrie, all the rest, Christine, then you will like Gerald's Game just as much, probably. It's one of those by the numbers, very basic, back to basics, basic type Stephen King books, but there's nothing wrong with that, because once you've seen the Stephen King formula executed perfectly once, there's nothing wrong with seeing it again and again and again. This is like my 15th Stephen King book or something. I'm never going to get around to reading all of his work, but I'm glad I'm going through at least the formative stuff, and it's taken me a while to get to this one, but I happened to see it in the book box. As you can see, this copy is in fucking horrible shape. The back photo of Stephen King here is just tattered to shit, and the front cover is torn off at the bottom. I have no idea. And then, the pages are falling apart and shit. But it was in a book box, so I was like, fuck it, I'll take it. When you see free Stephen King, you don't pass that shit up, because it's way better than, Valley of the Romance or my Wedding Proposal or whatever the fuck fills up most of the book boxes here in Denver. Anywho, Gerald's Game. Brief summary, obviously, and there will be spoilers in this, so if you haven't read Gerald's Game, even if you're familiar with the basic premise but don't know how it ends, then click away, go read Gerald's Game. I do highly recommend Gerald's Game if you haven't read it. This video is going to spoil a little bit about the ending. Gerald's Game is the exciting story set in a lake house in Maine. I know that's a common setting for Stephen King for whatever reason, because he's from Maine, which I can't fault him for, and he's probably has a lake house somewhere and spends time at it. I imagine it's a very relaxing sort of place to write. So he's like, why not just make this Maine lake house the setting of my book? Pretty easy. Write what you know. I say that for Stephen King. He writes what he knows. He writes about Maine lake houses a lot. It was also the setting in Secret Window, Secret Garden, whatever it was called, from 4 Past Midnight, which I also reviewed. Go check out my 4 Past Midnight review. It's set in a Maine lake house, and it follows Gerald and Jessie Burlingame, the happy couple in their 40s, I think. Yeah, so they're thinking, man, we want to get a little extra tonight. We want to get a little extreme. So Gerald snaps on the cuffs. He ties Jessie up to the bedpost, and then it turns out Gerald is a disgusting, deplorable rapist, and Jessie kicks him in the groin, and then he falls off the bed and dies. And from there, it's just a taut, gripping suspense ride of intrigue as Jesse has to navigate 2 days chained up to the bedpost with no food, barely any water, no resources at her disposal, and she just has to face the prospect of rotting away into nothing, atrophying as she's chained to the bedpost with her dead husband over the side of the bed. Pretty fun stuff, a pretty interesting premise from Stephen King here. I do have to say, Gerald's Game has a knockout premise that had me hooked immediately. Everything I've heard, this is one of Stephen King's longer-ish books. It clocks in at 125,000 words, and it is a little over 400 pages, 430. I was able to read it in just about under a week because it was thrilling. It had me hooked. I was on the edge of my seat the entire time. It is an exciting fucking book, and that is really impressive given that the entirety of it happens in just one room with just one character, and the entire thing is just the thoughts in her head as she faces the prospect of dying. So it's not your typical thriller where it's like you've got this badass action cop and he's going to stop the terrorist or whatever from blowing up the skyscraper. It's not your typical slasher type setup where you've got this helpless damsel in distress and she's being terrorized by Jason Voorhees, the big scary monster man. It's very subversive in that way, in that it's just about one very strong, capable female heroine and her confrontation with death, and the fact that she has to escape her inner demons, confront her inner problems before she can escape. So the escape in Gerald's Game happens on two levels. One is literal and one is metaphorical. She has to think about her trauma, her past baggage, the problems in her life, what led her up to this point in order to find the courage to escape. And once she does escape, man, that is an exciting scene. That feels like payoff for the 200 so pages of thoughts and stuff that happened before it. But there is not a single dull moment in Gerald's Game. Even though the ending is the most exciting, there's not a single point where I went, this is boring. Oh, what a snooze. No, Gerald's Game is fucking interesting from front to back. So the question must be asked, with Gerald's Game obviously, how well does this hold up as a piece of feminist literature? Obviously because it's written from the perspective of one female character, so Stephen King kind of has to get into the head of a woman in order to make this thing work. And I would say it holds up pretty damn well. I actually heard from a girl, she was seeing me reading this and came over and was like, man, that's a classic. Then we got to talking, and I mentioned that I like Stanley Kubrick movies, and she's like, oh, Stanley Kubrick, that guy was horrible to women. But from everything I've heard, the thing about Shelley Duvall is just an urban myth. And also from everything I've heard, he was totally nice to Nicole Kidman on the set of Eyes Wide Shut. So I'm not sure exactly where the rumor starts up that Stanley Kubrick was like horrible to women. But the question is, how well does Stephen King hold up as a feminist horror writer? Because obviously you have modern women complain about, oh, how it ends, oh, so-and-so. And Stephen King had written Carrie before this, obviously, and Gerald's Game was released simultaneously with Dolores Claiborne, and they're kind of meant to be like twin books. I didn't even know that while I was reading this. Whatever mention there is of Dolores Claiborne is so fleeting that it's like I didn't even notice or care. Gerald's Game stands perfectly fine on its own, disconnected from any of the larger Stephen King universe. But how well does Gerald's Game serve as a piece of feminist writing written by a guy, much less a guy who's married and all? Gerald's Game gives it a damn good shot. I will say that Jesse as a character talks like your basic Stephen King protagonist. Stephen King, as much as I like his premises and his exciting world building and all, he does not have too much range when it comes to writing from the voice of different characters. You see one Stephen King protagonist, you've kind of seen them all. They all have this kind of, oh, I'm better, oh, I'm a badass type affectation, I'm gonna solve this problem, I'm gonna lick it. I don't know if that's the most accurate way to describe it, but it's just how it comes off to me. It's like, it's very forthcoming, it's very like abrasive. I don't know, there's just something about the Stephen King protagonist. And Jesse's no different. I read her inner thoughts, her inner monologue, I'm like, yeah, this sounds like Stephen King here. But I will say that does go a long way towards making Jesse a likable, determined, forthcoming type protagonist who you can relate to, identify with, and empathize with. This is a great book for those guys who maybe can't empathize with women, so maybe you read Gerald's Game and you go, oh, here's what my girlfriend probably thinks, but I just don't recognize because I enjoy sex, and I don't think of my girlfriend as a person with thoughts, motivations, complex intricacies of her own. I really like how Stephen King is able to deconstruct the psychology of a person in 125,000 words. That's pretty damn impressive, if I'm going to be honest. It's not the greatest effort in that department or anything, and obviously movies like Old Boy, where you have a very similar premise of this guy's trapped in a room for a long time and he has to deal with himself and confront his issues. Like Old Boy is a similar, not the same obviously, but it has a similar type idea to it, and that does, I would say, a little better as a movie, but that's the medium of film, and this is the medium of book, and so they're going to be different. One is book, one is movie, one's book, whatever. Gerald's Game does pretty damn good for a book, and like I say, it's never boring, so there's that. So, how well does Gerald's Game stack up in terms of the traumatic parts? The parts that you might find a little too disturbing for your sensibilities. And given just how sensitive my generation tends to be with literature, there's some stuff in Gerald's Game that gives you quite the fright. But, that's the point of horror, is to unnerve and unsettle you. And this is definitely an unnerving, unsettling book. Not so much for me because I've read a ton of Stephen King, but for someone else, this might be a little more on the extreme end. Even more extreme than something like Christine, because it's not supernatural and it deals with purely real things that could actually happen, that are somewhat plausible. Well, I would say this. Gerald's Game handles the topic of rape and sexual assault better than The Library Policeman in 4 Past Midnight, which again I did a review on. Now that's not saying too much, because The Library Policeman is, and I stand by this, easily one of King's worst works ever. I do not recommend it personally. But Gerald's Game does better because it's dealing with a more realistic scenario. The characters don't have like a stupid Tigger voice or anything. So you're able to take it a little more seriously, and it's treated with gravity and respect, I would say, in Gerald's Game. It's handled with a sense of dignity. It's handled with a sense of this is actually a traumatic thing, and rapists are scum and they don't deserve respect as human beings because they're incapable of overcoming their primal instincts. This is a pretty faithful, accurate representation of how it feels. Suffice to say, I think Gerald's Game does a pretty good job. I think Stephen King is really trying to get into the head of a woman here and understand just how scary men can be. And men are fucking scary. I have to say, as a man myself, I do have to say, men can be fucking intimidating, scary, an absolute nightmare. So if you're a woman, this book might make you afraid of men, and if you're a man, this book might also make you afraid of men. It might go either way for you, because this book is scary as shit when it comes to men. Everything about men. This book is like that Alex Garland movie, Men, except it's actually effective and it's not fucking pretentious. Speaking of which, the adaptation by Mike Flanagan, the Gerald's Game movie, what do I think of that? Well, I haven't seen it, but going over a cursory look at the summary, it sounds like the only voice in Jesse's head in it is Gerald. Ruth Neary character, the Good Wife character, the Nora Callahan character, all these voices in Jessie's head that serve as her inner monologue, they're cut out, and it just sounds like it's Gerald in the Gerald's Game movie, which I think honestly gives Gerald a little too much power, a little too much influence, because what's great about Gerald's Game is that even though Gerald is the titular character, even though his name is in the title, and Game is even in his last name, the surname is Burlingame. I don't know if that's intentional or not, but it must kind of be, you know. He likes playing games. He's a little dipshit like that. I think that it gives him too much power over Jessie's mind to have him be the voice in her head, and I think that kind of defeats the purpose of the conflict between the good wife and Ruth Neary, these two battling ideologies, one saying you don't need any men to be successful and fulfilled in life, and the other saying you need to obey men, you know, be a Puritan, all of this. The two conflicting woman voices in Jessie's head. And I think that making Gerald a ghost or whatever, instead of just a corpse on the floor, which is so much more effective in the book, because it's like Gerald is just an inanimate object for most of it, so it completely removes the power or influence from him. He's actually the least intimidating male character as a result, because he doesn't fucking do anything. He just gets disemboweled, treated like a fucking joke. There is a point in here where Jessie steps over his bloated, decaying corpse and says, Gerald was a winner, now he's just the doggy's dinner. And I thought that was hilarious, because Gerald, based on what we see of him, is like a scumbag, like the worst possible kind of husband with just no respect for his wife whatsoever. I think it's much more poignant and much funnier too to just render him a bloated, decaying corpse rather than one of the voices, because that kind of gives him a little too much influence, I feel like. Again, I haven't seen the movie, and lots of people say it's great. Oh, it does the impossible. It makes this story that was thought to be unfilmable into a movie. Maybe it's good, but I doubt it's up there with, like, you know, the King classics like it, Dark Half and whatever. The Dark Half movie is seriously underrated, by the way. I don't know why more people haven't seen it. Anyway, in Gerald's Game, there are only 3 things I take issue with on a basic level. So the book is pretty much damn perfect except for these 3 things, and these things kind of broke the immersion for me. First and foremost, there's the idea that she provides a cover-up story to the police that explains what happened, because obviously, even if he was going to make out with her without her consent while she's handcuffed to the bed, and she's like, no, and she kicks him, and then he falls off, and he rots away into a corpse or whatever. That would be probably a little worse for her than this cover story she provides, where it turns out that, like, she just hit her head on the post or something and knocked herself out, and then Gerald died too. I forget the exact specifics of the cover story. But this cover story she provides to the police doesn't allow for the injury on her hand, which is like this gaping wound where half the skin is peeled back and all her tendons have been disconnected. Again, spoilers. I feel like, given that that's like the most noticeable thing about her after the event of Gerald's Game, where, you know, her hand is all fucked up, and she has to presumably get surgery to have those tendons reattached and ligaments fixed and whatever, I feel like the cover story isn't really convincing. Like, no policeman would buy that. And the implication with Gerald's Game is that she is a very upper middle class sort of woman who's capable of bending the rules around her, and she has, you know, a rich lawyer husband, so obviously she's able to make up things and skirt the law and like that, which is very convenient. This might not be a very relatable book for women who aren't the husbands of crazy rich lawyers. Like, this book would be a little different. It'd actually be a little more tense if, for instance, Jessie couldn't get an immediate surgery that would just fix her hand, you know, say she's on healthcare or something. That might be a little more relatable to the average woman or average person, just that, like, you don't get to have a fancy cover-up and your name is out of the papers. You know, your name won't be in the papers to begin with. So Stephen King is writing from a very, like, privileged position here, obviously. I don't necessarily fault him for that. It's just what the story is about, you know. It's about this this rich asshole lawyer and his wife who has to recognize that having a husband isn't necessary. So we're not talking about class consciousness here or anything. But I will say the cover-up story that's provided to the police isn't really convincing. If I was a cop, I wouldn't buy it. If I was a lawyer, I wouldn't buy that for a second. It doesn't sound accurate at all. But, you know, so be it. The implication is she can just say anything and get away with it, which is kind of a deus ex machina, or, you know, plot hole, whatever. That's nitpicking. I'll allow that. Second thing is, after she has this immense blood loss, after she severed herself from the handcuff of death by basically mutilating herself, she has a ton of blood loss, and when she passes out right before nighttime comes and the Moonlight Man is back, it says that she like wakes up again. And I just don't find that realistic at all. Like, after you've fucked your hand up to that extent, you've lost this much blood. Because, like she says, the common talking point, which I've heard before about how people cut their wrists because there's the least nerves there, so it doesn't hurt that much. But at the same time, when you do cut your wrist, like, you do die, because that's where most of the blood flow comes from, right here on this vein. I mean, it's not like an aorta or anything, but you will have gushers of blood coming out from there. So that's also why people cut their wrists, not just because it hurts the least, but because it's where the most possible amount of blood is going to come out, ensuring death. And somehow she's able to wake up and get in a car. Okay, I mean, I guess it's theoretically possible, but I just feel like she would have died, honestly. Like, if she hadn't gotten, I don't know, some food, because she gets water near the end of the book, like a ton of water, but that's not the stuff blood is made out of. She has to have some nutrients. If she got into the kitchen and fixed herself a sandwich, I might buy that she could wake up, but it's just difficult to imagine waking up after that much blood loss. Again, that's kind of a nitpick. Stephen King has probably looked up medical facts more than me in his research for the book, so I'll give him that. I'll allow that. The third thing that really bothered me about Gerald's Game, and this might be the big one, is the character of Moonlight Man at the end is revealed to be not only like a grave robber, which we kind of already knew, but he's revealed to have acromegaly, and that's why his hands hang all the way down to his knees, and he has this distended look to his face. He has this pouty expression. I'm not one of those who are prone to say that you can't have, like, disabled characters in fiction or horror be the bad guy or whatever, or that a distended look isn't necessarily scary. I just feel like acromegaly is kind of a cop-out, and it's kind of a cliche. It's been a cliche in horror ever since Rondo Hatton. I've seen it a gazillion times, and it's just like, are horror writers ever going to resort to a different deformity that's a little more wild or out there? Like, you know, say the killer's like a half mermaid or something, like in House of a Thousand Corpses or something. I just feel like when you rely time and again on this real-life deformity, acromegaly, and you pretend like it can do anything or make someone look any kind of way, when, like, medically, there's very specific parameters to it. I feel like it's a cop-out that Moonlight Man has acromegaly when, like, his hands hang all the way down to his fucking knees. I feel like a more interesting explanation would just be, hey, what if he wears prosthetic hands to freak people out that are, like, super long? That could be a cool explanation. Instead, Stephen King just resorts to the same old cliche of acromegaly that I've seen 1,000 fucking times in horror stories. And it's like, why is this the crutch that horror authors always arrive at to explain any kind of physical deformity? It's always acromegaly. And it's like, you know, this just isn't like the jackpot you think it is. It's a cliche. I feel like for a villain like Moonlight Man, you could have done so much better and come up with such a more interesting twist. I was waiting for, like, why does Moonlight Man have hands that hang down to his knees? Is he like a mutant or something? Is he an X-Man, you know? Again, he's going for a realistic, non-supernatural explanation, but I just feel like that's the most boring shit. Looks like we're about halfway through the review. So in keeping with the convention of Gerald's game, I'm going to have this life-saving sip of water here. Ah, that saved my life just now. Anyway, the other thing that bothers me about the character of Moonlight Man, aside from his acromegaly being the explanation for how he has these abnormally long arms, is I feel like Moonlight Man is kind of given overkill in the last chapter, and too much is explained about him. And Stephen King thinks, wow, the more extreme I make this character, the more scary he'll be. But actually it's the opposite. The less scary he is, the more Stephen King just goes into overkill with every detail about how sick and twisted Moonlight Man is. Says, oh, you know, first off, he's a grave robber. Obviously, we already knew that because he has his little suitcase full of human bones. So, you know, that's disturbing enough. Being a grave robber is pretty sick and twisted, and we can get by with that. But then it just goes on and on about how Moonlight Man, you know, used to kill animals. Moonlight Man was having sex with the corpses, too. Moonlight Man was a rapist and a murderer and a pedophile and on. I just feel like all these details, when they add on to each other, is just like, this guy is too fucking extreme. Like with a supernatural character, I could kind of get it, because like, you know, you can do all this in an abnormally long life or whatever if you're a ghost or whatever, but like, he's just a guy. And furthermore, he has acromegaly and his hands are like hanging down by his knees, which I imagine would be incredibly painful, you know. Not only would this make his arms long, but like what Stephen King doesn't seem to recognize is that like when you have a bone deformity and you have your hands that fucking long, like it's going to be incredibly painful. So how is this guy breaking into crypts? How is he like an expert locksmith with just like so much dexterity when his arms are like fucking twice the length they should be? I feel like that's got to not be medically accurate, that like this guy would be that dexterous and sly and shit. Especially sneaky. Like, how the fuck does he get away with all this shit for like decades and when like his hands are twice as long as they should be? How does he open up crypts? Like, what the fuck? So I just feel like that's kind of implausible. Like, maybe if he opens up a couple crypts, just keeps going back to the same ones and doing his thing, just by luck, you know, maybe some of the locks on them are defective or whatever. But it's not that easy to get into a crypt. You have to have, like, fucking crowbar and shit and, you know, lock-picking equipment. It's complicated. And to think this guy can do that with just, like, these hands, like, dangle and shit, I don't really buy that. So that's kind of the main deal for me with Gerald's game. It's just, like, the character of Moonlight Man feels like total overkill. And it actually makes it less believable the more details are given about just like, yeah, Moonlight Man, who's like the sickest, fucking, most depraved bastard ever, just, you know, he puts Hannibal Lecter to shame, and it's like, okay, but from everything that's described about him, I don't really feel like he has the means to do all this shit. It's just kind of unrealistic for me. That broke the immersion straight away. But other than that, I think the ending is pretty good. And I do like the character of Moonlight Man in theory. The first time he's revealed, he is pretty spooky, and I think he could be fun as a character. It's just, just explain it all with, like, he has acromegaly. I don't at all think he should have just been a figment of Jesse's imagination. I think that would be a fucking cop-out. It's way scarier that Moonlight Man is real, but at the same time, to have him be, like, this tottering, you know, my arms are twice as long, and I have this horrible upbringing. It makes him a little too sympathetic, honestly. It'd be more scary if he was a legitimate threat instead of just like this character that Jesse can just, you know, fuck off and run away. And I mean, he's not as scary as like Jason Voorhees or anything. But again, I think that's kind of the point. Stephen King is trying to make it so that the antagonist is barely even an antagonist, and the main conflict is fought within Jesse's head. And Gerald is barely even a fucking character. He's more of a plot device that gets the story moving. Like I say, that's the main difference between the book and the movie. And I think the book sounds way more effective in that term, because Gerald should not be an active presence, like, at all. I find the notion that Jessie has these voices going on in her head really fucking interesting. This is some of the most interesting stuff in the book, is when these voices pop out and they like bicker and squabble with each other. I just find that really interesting. Ruth Neary is the feminist perspective, and Good Wife Burlingame is the Puritan perspective, and you see the battle between them, the ideological inconsistencies, and they're all Jessie. Get right down to it. This book has a very interesting character arc where Jessie goes from, ooh, I'll let my husband handcuff me up to the bed because it sounds exciting, to, I never want to have sex with any man again as long as I live, and I'm perfectly content with sleeping alone, and I'm just going to sleep. And that is a damn interesting character arc if ever there was one, and one that I, as an asexual, can fully get behind. This is a very, very interesting book, and it's actually amazing that a guy like Stephen King, who as far as I know has been married most of his life, could write a book with this much pathos and intensity. It seems like, legitimate empathy for the female condition. It's not always delivered the most effectively, I will say, but there is a point near the end where she talks about her new guy friend, Brandon Milheron, and how he is implied to have sort of a crush on her. But as far as she's concerned, she's never having sex with men ever again after what she's been through. And nobody sane would ever fault her for not wanting to have sex anymore. It's implied that Brandon Milheron, even though he's very helpful with the cover-up story and all, and getting her back on track, he doesn't believe everything she says, and he tries to stop her from spitting in Moonlight Man's face. And Stephen King arrives at a very interesting conclusion here when he says, men don't believe women, even if they come off as nice, even if they come off as helpful or obliging. They don't believe women as much as women can believe women. And that is a terrifying concept. Gerald's game will make you scared of men, like I say. And the conclusion that Jessie ultimately arrives at is fascinating. And it is that you are all alone in life. You don't have anything to depend on other than your own willpower, your own drive to live. That is all that keeps you alive. And you will die alone, too. What a fascinating conclusion to arrive at from Stephen King. I wouldn't necessarily expect such depth from him, and I'm not even sure he was thinking about how deep that message ultimately is when he was writing it. But there is a point where Jessie comes to the realization that she is all alone in these handcuffs, and if she doesn't think quick, if she doesn't act with resourcefulness, she is going to die from malnutrition and atrophy. What a fantastic conclusion to arrive at, because in life, you really are all alone. You can't count on your stupid lawyer husband to solve all your problems for you. At a certain point, if he's out of the picture, if he's down on the floor and some dog is eating his corpse, you're going to have to figure out what to do on your own. And that is a hella feminist message, not to mention a hella humanist message, because it does away with any of the namby-pamby romantic sentiment. And it just says, if you want to save yourself, you gotta do it on your own. Like, your husband isn't going to help out, because your husband, he's on the other team. Obviously, Jessie is implied to have a lot of traumatic backstory, and Gerald is kind of a surrogate of her father. I won't go too much into depth on that, obviously, because it happens halfway through. I feel like the flashback scene is easily, actually the scariest part of the book, maybe even more so than the climax. The climax is more exciting, where she escapes, but the middle part is like the most just gut-wrenching, scary shit. So here's a character who goes on a character arc from point A to point B. She starts out as the compliant, lawyer's wife. She falls in line. She does what Gerald asks. He's like, babe, I want to handcuff you up, please. And she's like, okay. And then she ends the book as a complete, total, self-sufficient badass who's got a new outlook on life and decided, I don't need a husband. And I think that's such a fantastic frickin' character arc for a character to go down. As an asexual, I think it would have been a total cop-out if it ended with, like, you know, Brandon Milheron bursting in, saving her, then they get married. Yeah, I really am glad Stephen King isn't a fucking hack like that. Because in some other writer's hand, I'm sure that's how it would end, and that would just be like total shit. This book really does portray sex as the saddest, most desperate thing that only maladjusted, insecure people resort to. And as an asexual, I also have to agree with that to a certain extent. Sex is fucking sad. It's a depressing thing, and it won't make you happy. No one should want to be like Gerald in this book. Gerald is a bastard. From the little bit we get of him in the first couple chapters, there's nothing likable, interesting, fun about Gerald. Gerald fucking sucks. No one should want to be like Gerald, the same way no one should want to be like Donald Trump, who of course is a highly sexual being. So, Gerald is a stand-in for toxic masculinity, patriarchy, sexual enjoyment, sexual attraction. Gerald is all those things manifest. Like I say, he's more of a plot device than a character. He's sort of symbolic, but his presence does linger through the pages without you dwelling too much on it. Gerald is sort of an ideal in that regard. What an interesting fucking concept, I have to say. There are points in this book where Stephen King undermines the importance of sexuality to an extent that I would not expect an allosexual to be capable of. For instance, there's the detail that Jessie is infertile. So she can't have children. She's in her 40s. She's approaching the period where people can't even have children anymore. So the typical excuse and justification for sex where it's like, oh, sex will produce the next generation of people, doesn't even apply here. Nobody is going to be born or brought into the world or anything beautiful like that as a result of Gerald's game. It's just not going to happen. Gerald is just going to have his big grunty sexy time, and then he's going to flop off, you know, get drunk, and the cycle would repeat itself. Fortunately, you know, what happens, happens, and the character arc begins, the voyage of self-discovery and inner turmoil. But the detail that Jessie is infertile, I think, is very much intentional and designed to show just how pointless the sex they're having is, how it won't solve any of their problems, it won't help either of them get to a point of self-sufficiency and self-respect with themselves. I like that detail. It's worth putting in there that, like, Jessie doesn't have sex for any reason. It's literally just for Gerald to have fun, or what he thinks is fun. It's not genuine fun. It's just like the boring, middle-aged, depressed replacement of fun, sexual behavior. And then he goes and gets drunk and whatever and earns his big fat paycheck at the lawyer firm. The other thing is when Jessie drinks from the tap and she has water for the first time in 2 days, and she remarks that it is comparable to an orgasm, if not more so. And I have to agree, after 2 days chained to a bed with no nutrients of any kind, just one tiny little sip of water and atrophying muscles, drinking from the bathtub is more important than having sex. That's to undermine the point of sex, which is supposedly that it's like the greatest rush of serotonin one can possibly feel. That's not even true. After 2 days of atrophy, you want water, and the water is going to be more important than sex. Ultimately, when Jessie breaks free from the handcuff, by any means necessary, because it's stated that this is going to be her last chance. She's running out of energy to live. She's running out of the drive to exist. She's either going to fall asleep and never wake up, or she's going to cut her hand open and break out of the fucking handcuff. It's stated that she chooses to cut her hand open and break out of the fucking handcuff because she doesn't want to die, and dying is unpleasant. So in this regard, I think what Stephen King is saying is that the drive for survival, to perpetuate oneself, is greater than the reproductive drive. The reproductive drive is a secondary drive, and if you put it in the pilot's seat, like Gerald does, you are just going to die. If all you can think of is getting on top and going at it and doing it, then you will just die. But Jessie, makes the correct choice of, I'm going to cut my hand open and get out of this fucking handcuff, and I'm going to live, damn it. I'm going to live to see another day. The survival instinct outweighs the sexual instinct. That is a universal psychological phenomenon as far as I'm aware. People would rather live than have sex. So to anyone who says, oh, sex is so important because it's the most important instinct or whatever. No, the instinct to live is the most important instinct. And Gerald's game really illustrates that in painful detail. I can't believe I have to say this to people sometimes. The interest of self-preservation is greater in anyone, except I guess in people like Gerald. It is far greater than the reproductive drive. That's just true. So, did I enjoy Gerald's game? Even though it's a book about sex, it's not a sexy book at all. This is not an attractive or erotic book in any way, and I like that. It strips all the sexiness out of sex. There's nothing that would turn anyone on here unless they're sick in the head. This is really just a scary book that's all about being scared of sex, what sex means, what sex is, and learning to avoid it for the remainder of one's life. Do I like this book? Fuck yes, this is a really fun book. It's not necessarily the most convincing in terms of being a feminist text. Like I say, Stephen King does have kind of limited range there. I can't fault him for that. Just the same way I can't really fault him for only writing about lake houses in Maine, because that's all he really knows, and that's just his deal. But this book is really interesting, and if you want to spend 125,000 words stuck in someone's head as they come to the realization that they might die if they spend too much time atrophying, and this is exactly how I feel when I was on tour, and I had to sit out in the cold for like 12 hours because all the parks are closed and shit, so I have to like either walk around or sit out in the cold, like in some ditch or something, and my leg muscles were atrophying, and it's like, this is not a pleasant way to go. Confront the realization that you could die, that you could just stop existing. That is a profound and interesting realization to arrive at. Recently happened to me, so I've been through a similar ordeal, and I've come to recognize like how great it is to live, to exist, to be. Gerald's game really will make you happy that you've never been through an ordeal like this. It will make you scared of men and sex, which I guess is the point of it, the same way Christine is designed to make you afraid of cars. I think this is a great book to read if you're asexual, also if you're allosexual. Really, you'll arrive at a different conclusion, perhaps, but you will arrive at an interesting conclusion, which I think all books should do in some way or another. And you will have fun, even though it is very long and it is from the perspective of one character in one room. There is not a point where it is boring, and that is a testament to how well Stephen King is able to fill in little details, little gaps in the memory, little anecdotes and the like that keep things interesting and keep things moving along and keep a general sense of tension throughout. And I think Moonlight Man is an interesting antagonist for the most part. I think he's kind of botched, but I do get what it's going for. It would be freakish to see this guy while you're chained up, even if it's explained at the end that he only makes out with dead people, which she would be in a day. So I guess that's kind of the implication, but I think more so the implication is, again, to create an antagonist that isn't really like the big scary Freddy Krueger, is just kind of a passive observer, and a protagonist that is entirely active. Her mind is just racing along at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and she's thinking, how the fuck can I get out of this scenario I got into, and how can I escape? How can I get the fuck out? I need to escape, and to escape, she needs to go into her mind and confront her inner demons, her turmoil, think about what happened, and confront that. So it's very interesting in that regard. Is it the most nuanced exploration of any of these themes? No, not by a long shot. It's the same blockbuster commercialized treatment that Stephen King will give to any subject. But is there anything wrong with that? No. It's very, very interesting throughout, and there's not a point during this entire book where I was bored by it, which is really a testament to the quality of Stephen King's writing. As someone who doesn't like romance, and I think that a lot of people in my life, I start out thinking they're very interesting and could perhaps serve as my intellectual match, but then they start getting romantic with a boyfriend or something and they lose all their charm. They become boring, routine sort of people. And I only really find people interesting when they're incapable of romantic attraction or sexual attraction. I have to say, this book was a really interesting exploration of the sexual process and how sexual attraction works, how romantic attraction works, etc. It goes in depth about it. It's a really interesting fucking book. And not once throughout this entire book do I feel like Stephen King is objectifying or pandering to the female character, doing anything less than trying to paint her as, a person with complex wants and desires and interests and things. Yeah, I mean, that's ultimately what a good writer will do. Try and humanize the characters that they write about and try and make you, man, I really hope she gets out of this fucking handcuff, but yeah, she doesn't. She's going to die. That's pretty messed up. So yeah, this book is freaking great. I really liked it. There are some flaws to it, like I say. Some of the plot seems a little too convenient, how everything falls into place. So what am I going to give Gerald's Game? The Stephen King thriller-diller all about being handcuffed up and having to watch as a dog eats up your husband on the floor. Man, that was actually a funny part for me. I found that bit fucking hilarious, while the husband just gets like fucking eaten to pieces. A lesser writer would have the dog try to, bite up Jessie or something or attack her, but actually it's much more effective that the dog just eats Gerald. Nom nom. That's such a fun image to think about. What do I give Gerald's Game? Final score for Gerald's Game. I would have to say it's not my favorite Stephen King book. I do like Christine a little more. I do like Tommyknockers more. I definitely like it more than this. So I would say probably an 8 out of 10. It's not as bad as something like Insomnia. It's much more directed. This is a nail-biting suspense ride, but it's not the most interesting premise Stephen King has ever covered. There are some bits that made me, especially near the end, like I say again with how Moonlight Guy has acromegaly, because it's just a total cliche. So 8 out of 10. That's a very decent score. Gerald's Game is a good book, and I get why people mention it in the same breath as Stephen King's other masterworks and literary classics. It's a lot of fun to read, provided you're able to kind of detach yourself from the characters, because you're like super sensitive to descriptions of this stuff. It's going to be a gruesome, riveting ride for you. Let me just say that. This could be a very disturbing read to those who are not prepared for it, but if you're in for a spooky fucking time, then Gerald's Game is for you. It will freak you out, and you will be just absolutely waiting for the end to come, because it's a roller coaster ride. It's thrilling. So yeah, there you go. There's my long-awaited review of Gerald's Game, the book about the handcuffs. Heck yeah. That's all for this time. That's all for this book. I'm glad I'm going through all the Stephen King classics. I'm surprised it took so long for me to come around to this one, but I'm very glad I did. I found this one immensely interesting and a good time all around. Yeah, that's it for today's book review. If you'd like to buy my horror novel, Frames of Reference, or any of the other stuff in the Nicholas Comics catalog, just write to Nicholas Cicada, 1424 Columbine Street, number 1, Denver, Colorado, 80206, and your comics will be delivered to you within the week. You get a free catalog, you fill it out, you send it in, I send it back. It's been that way ever since 2018. What is it, 8 years strong at this point. Fuck yes. Denver's best comics. That's all that this video is brought to you by. It's not brought to you by HelloFresh or NordVPN or any of that shit. It's just my comics. So that's it for today's book review. Sayonara, suckers. Sporish. Or both, right? Both are my catchphrase. Okay, whatever.